Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We are diving headfirst into John chapter 2 today.
Yeah, and this is a seriously pivotal chapter, isn't it?
It really is. It marks Jesus' real step out of, well, his private life and into the spotlight of his public ministry.
And what's particularly fascinating about this chapter, I think, is how John frames that launch.
How so?
Well, he puts two seemingly contrasting events right next to each other. You've got this joyful wedding celebration up in Galilee,
Right, Cana.
and then, bam, a pretty intense confrontation in the Jerusalem temple. It almost feels jarring at first.
Totally. And our mission in this deep dive is really to understand why John does that.
Yeah, what connects these two moments? What's he trying to tell us about Jesus right from the get-go?
Exactly. And to help us figure that out, we've pulled together, well, quite a stack of sources. We've got ancient historical accounts, some sharp modern scholarship, deep biblical analysis, and some really rich devotional insights, too.
Yeah.
Especially from Ellen G. White's The Desire of Ages.
So we're going to explore how these events introduce some foundational themes John keeps coming back to,
Like what?
like the idea of signs, the semeia that reveal Christ's glory, the hint that something old is being replaced by something new,
Right.
and how these moments even subtly foreshadow Jesus' own death and resurrection. It's pretty dense.
It's all packed into just 25 verses. Amazing. So let's jump right into the first scene then. The wedding at Cana.
Sounds good. John chapter 2, starting right there in verse 1. The setting is Galilee, just a couple of days after Jesus started calling his first disciples, apparently.
And to really get this scene, you need the historical context, right?
Absolutely crucial.
Because Galilean weddings weren't just like a quick afternoon ceremony. They were huge, week-long community events, massive celebrations.
Imagine hosting that. The whole town involved.
Seriously. And running out of wine.
Yeah.
That wasn't just a minor social blunder.
Oh no, it was a major, major embarrassment for the host family. Could even, some sources suggest, lead to legal issues for failing in their hospitality duties.
Wow. So it was a full-blown crisis unfolding.
Pretty much. And into this moment, you have Jesus, his mother Mary, and the new disciples arriving.
And then John gives us this specific detail about the 6 large stone jars.
Right. And as we dug into the historical context, we learned these weren't just, random storage containers.
Now, were they then?
These were specifically the kind of jars used for Jewish ritual washings, katharismos.
Ah, okay. And they were huge, right?
Massive, holding 20 to 30 gallons each. And the stone material was key.
Why stone?
Because, unlike clay, stone was considered non-porous and didn't become ritually unclean according to the purity laws back then.
Gotcha. So they represented this whole system of ritual purity, of cleansing.
Exactly. But what's striking here is that in this moment of real human need, the parties literally run out of wine. These symbols of ritual purification are sitting there empty.
They couldn't actually fix the present problem.
Right. They couldn't meet the real immediate need. And that leads us straight into the theological heart of the story.
Which is,
Well, John is very deliberate. He calls this Jesus's first semeion, his first sign.
okay, a sign pointing to what?
It pointed to his divine doxa, his glory. And the result, the text says the disciples believed in him.
So it wasn't just a cool miracle, it was a revelation.
Precisely. A window into who he actually was.
And the symbolism of the wine itself is huge too, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. Throughout the Old Testament, you see wine often associated with messianic times, with covenantal blessing and abundance.
Like in the prophets. Amos, maybe?
Yeah, Amos 9, Genesis 49, passages about overflowing blessings in the age to come. So by creating this vast amount of wine, Jesus is performing a messianic act. He's signaling that the time of promised blessing is arriving through him.
Ellen White captures this really beautifully in The Desire of Ages, doesn't she?
She does. She sees this not just as a practical fix, but as an expression of creative power. She even links it back to God's work in creation. And for her, it's even more. It's a symbol of spiritual grace, showing that Christ comes to fill our lives with joy and hope, to transform the ordinary.
That transformation water into wine seems loaded with meaning when you think about those jars.
Totally. The ritual water, maybe representing the old system, law in a sense, is transformed into this abundant wine.
Symbolizing the overflowing grace of the new covenant Jesus is bringing.
But that's how many read it, yeah. And White makes an interesting point about the quality of the wine.
What did she say?
She describes it as unfermented and superior. Not regular wine, but something representing the untainted, pure blessings of God's grace, not something corrupted or, lesser.
And you really see that superiority reflected in the reaction of the master of the banquet, right?
Absolutely. He's genuinely stunned. Everyone serves the good wine first, but you have saved the best till now.
It's this perfect contrast, isn't it? Human planning and resources falling short.
Versus divine intervention bringing something unexpectedly better and way more abundant.
Yeah. Now, that interaction between Jesus and his mother, Mary, that's interesting too.
It is. He addresses her as woman, Jainai, in the Greek.
Which sounds kind of harsh to our ears, maybe.
It can, but in that culture, it could actually be a respectful term. But here, especially with the phrase that follows, it seems to signal a shift.
What phrase is that?
What to me and you, or sometimes translated, what has this to do with me and you? Di emwe kai soy.
Okay, what's the significance there?
Well, looking at Old Testament usage, our sources show it's a phrase often used when someone is, like, questioning or trying to interfere with a divine plan or prerogative.
Like in Judges or Kings.
Exactly. So Jesus seems to be gently but firmly indicating that his actions are now governed by his divine mission and his Father's timing, not solely by family ties or immediate social pressures.
That makes sense. And White's insight on Mary's instruction to the servants, do whatever he tells you, that's powerful.
It really is. White sees it as the perfect model of faith. Complete surrender, trusting obedience, even when you don't fully grasp the how or when. Mary just trusted his authority.
That's great. You know, the scholars added some cool little historical nuggets too.
Like what?
Like the third day mentioned in verse 1, it might not just be a time marker. Origen, an early church writer, apparently calculated it as 3 days after Nathanael's call in chapter 1.
Oh, interesting. So John might be building a deliberate sequence right from the start.
Possibly. And Cana itself is usually identified with modern Kafr Cana, which is only about 9 miles from Nazareth. So, close to home.
Right, keeping it local. And that symbolism of the 6 jars comes back in scholarship too.
How so?
Well, 6, being one short of 7, the number often linked with perfection or completion, might symbolize human imperfection or incompleteness.
And Jesus fills them
To the brim, producing, what, 120 to 180 gallons of wine? It's this massive, almost excessive amount.
powerfully symbolizing that overflowing, abundant grace that just dwarfs human need and expectation. So, okay, stepping back for a moment, thinking about this story, maybe in your own life, are there areas where you feel that lack, that scarcity, where you feel like you've hit the limits of your own resources, or maybe human systems, like those empty ritual jars? The Cana story is this profound statement, really, that Christ can step into that inadequacy. He can bring transformation and abundance.
And there's that practical key from Mary, isn't there?
Yeah, that obedience, do whatever he tells you, just filling the jars with water. That simple act of obedience often precedes seeing the miracle, right? Seeing the transformation happen.
It's a great point. And from this scene of, well, joyful, miraculous transformation, John makes a really dramatic shift.
He does, doesn't he? Takes us straight from a wedding feast in Galilee
To the bustling and, as it turns out, corrupted marketplace right inside the Jerusalem temple complex.
Right, John 2, starting around verse 13. And this is happening during the Passover festival.
Which means Jerusalem is absolutely packed. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims.
So we need to picture the scene. This is happening in the court of the Gentiles, the outer courtyard. And it had apparently become this hub for selling animals needed for sacrifices.
And the money changers, swapping foreign currency for the specific Tyrian shekel required for the temple tax.
And historical sources, like the Jewish historian Josephus, they seem to confirm this wasn't just convenient service.
No, not at all. It had become deeply exploitative. Merchants, money changers, likely charging exorbitant prices and fees, basically fleecing the pilgrims who had traveled, often long distances, to come and worship.
Turning a sacred space into a marketplace, basically, a profiteering zone.
Pretty much. And you have to remember, with Passover bringing all those crowds, the temple wasn't just a religious site. It was a massive economic engine and a political center, too.
So when Jesus comes in, making a whip and driving them out, this is far from just a simple outburst of anger.
Absolutely not. This was a direct, very public challenge to the religious authorities, the ones who allowed and probably profited from this whole system, a system that was deeply intertwined with Roman authority as well.
It was a huge statement. And theologically, this act resonates with Scripture, doesn't it?
Deeply. The disciples later remembered Psalm 69.9, "Zeal for your house will consume me."
So Jesus' action wasn't just random anger. It was rooted in this divine passion, this zeal for the holiness of God's house.
Exactly. Ellen White frames this cleansing as an act of divine justice, driven by Christ's desire to restore genuine communion between God and humanity.
Her point is, his indignation was specifically aimed at those who had turned the house of prayer into, well, a den of thieves, right?
Yeah.
Blocking sincere worship with their commercialism and greed.
Yes, and then when the Jewish leaders confront him, demanding a sign to prove his authority for doing all this, his response is incredibly layered, almost cryptic at first.
Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.
Right. And the leaders immediately think he's talking about the physical temple building, which took decades to build.
But John, writing his gospel later, makes sure we don't miss the real point.
He immediately clarifies, but he was speaking about the temple of his body.
That's just groundbreaking. Jesus is directly linking his own impending death and resurrection to the replacement of the physical temple structure itself.
It's a massive claim, and White really emphasizes this. She points out that the resurrection would be the ultimate, the irrefutable sign.
The sign that vindicated Jesus' authority.
Yes, and proved that he was the true dwelling place of God, the ultimate reality that the physical temple had only ever pointed towards.
Now, this is where that interesting scholarly debate comes in about the timing.
Right. Because if you read the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptics, they place a temple cleansing event right at the end of Jesus' ministry.
During Holy Week, just before his crucifixion.
Exactly. But John puts this one right here, at the very beginning.
So what do scholars make of that?
Well, figures like F.F. Bruce or E.P. Sanders, among others, have debated it. Some suggest there might have been two separate cleanings.
Oh, really? Like one early on?
Yeah, as John records it, maybe to announce his mission and challenge the system right from the start.
And then another one later.
Perhaps. A later one that really accelerated the conflict leading to the cross, as the Synoptics describe.
But regardless of whether it was one or two, John's decision to place it here early on is clearly strategic.
Absolutely. It immediately establishes Jesus' authority, his challenge to the status quo, and it foreshadows his death and resurrection as central to his purpose, right from the outset of his public work.
And White adds another layer to how we understand the temple cleansing itself, doesn't she? She talks about Jesus' holy discontent.
That's a powerful phrase, and she points to the detail John includes. Jesus braided a whip of cords.
Implying it wasn't just an impulsive, uncontrolled rage.
Exactly. White interprets this as a deliberate, a measured action, reflecting not just anger, but a deep divine sorrow over the desecration of what was meant to be holy.
That's insightful.
Yeah, and her perspective on the temple prophecy, destroy this temple, highlights Jesus' self-awareness about his own path.
How so?
She notes that the hour he often referred to later, the time of his suffering and sacrifice, that was the true means of purifying worship. It went beyond cleaning the physical temple. It pointed to his ultimate sacrifice for sin as the real cleansing agent.
Wow. Okay, so let's connect this temple cleansing scene to, our lives today. How does this challenge us? How should we think about the integrity of our own faith and worship?
It's a strong challenge, isn't it? Where might worldly ambitions or maybe commercial thinking or just plain self-interest subtly creep into spaces we consider spiritual or holy?
Whether that's, a church building or just our own hearts and minds.
Right. White's challenge feels really potent here. God's house must reflect holiness, not worldly ambition. It's something to really wrestle with.
Definitely. So when we put the wedding at Cana and the temple cleansing side by side the way John does, it becomes pretty clear they aren't just random events he threw in.
No, they seem intentionally paired, designed to show us different facets of Jesus' identity and mission right from the very beginning.
Absolutely. Think about the parallels and contrasts we've seen.
Yep.
One is set at a celebration, a wedding in Galilee. The other at the central place of worship, the temple in Jerusalem.
Right. Different settings.
The problem at Cana is a lack, a scarcity, no wine. The problem at the temple is corruption, exploitation.
Different problems, yeah.
Scarcity versus corruption.
Jesus' action at Cana is transformation water becoming wine.
Mm-hmm.
His action at the temple is purification, driving out those who defile the space.
Transformation versus purification. Got it.
The symbolism at Cana points to the abundance of the new covenant, that overflowing grace.
Mm-hmm.
The symbolism at the temple points towards true worship being restored and ultimately centered in Jesus himself.
New covenant abundance versus true worship restored.
And the outcome. At Cana, disciples' faith is awakened. The text says they believed.
At the temple, opposition is immediately provoked from the religious authorities. They demand a sign.
Faith awakened versus opposition provoked. That's a great summary of the contrasts.
And this pairing seems really central to John's whole theological approach in his gospel, this idea of replacement.
Explain that a bit more.
Well, at Cana, you have the abundant wine effectively replacing the ritual purification water. It signals grace superseding the old system in a way.
Okay, grace over ritual.
And at the temple, Jesus explicitly talks about his resurrected body replacing the stone building. He becomes the ultimate dwelling place of God, the true center of worship.
Ah, so his body replaces the physical temple. Both instances show Christ's supremacy over the existing Jewish institutions and rituals.
Exactly, and historical scholarship kind of underscores this. John's unique timing, putting the temple cleansing so early.
Yeah.
It seems like a deliberate choice to frame Jesus' entire ministry right from the start as this inevitable clash between divine grace and the established, sometimes corrupted religious system.
That makes sense. And you mentioned Origen's idea about the wedding being on the third day.
Right. Some see that as subtly linking Cana to the dawn of a new creation almost, positioning Jesus' arrival and first sign as the beginning of something fundamentally new breaking into the world.
Fascinating. And Ellen White's insight on the disciples' faith journey here is really helpful too, I think.
How their faith evolved.
Yeah. They believed at Cana because they saw the sign, the miracle. But their full understanding, especially of that temple prophecy.
That Jesus was talking about his body.
Right. That only clicked after the resurrection when they remembered his words.
So it shows how faith can start with seeing God's power, maybe.
Yeah, but it matures, it deepens as we come to understand how Christ fulfills Scripture through his death and resurrection, his completed work.
That's a really important point about discipleship. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into John chapter 2, what are the core takeaways, the things we can really carry with us?
Well, first, I'd say divine abundance. That story of Cana is just such a powerful reminder that Jesus isn't limited by our lack, or by the inadequacy of human systems.
You can step into those modules.
He can step in and bring transformation, and often, as Mary showed, simple obedience is the first step he asks for.
Fill the jars.
Yeah.
Okay, what's second?
Second takeaway has to be worship integrity. The temple cleansing is, well, it's a pretty stark challenge, isn't it? To constantly examine our own spiritual spaces, whether that's individually, in our hearts, or communally, and be willing to root out anything that compromises holiness. Any mixture of worldly ambition or commercialism with genuine faith.
A call to keep things pure, focused on God.
Right.
And finally,
maybe the most crucial, the ultimate sign. Beyond the miracles, beyond even the temple cleansing itself, Jesus points to his body as the true temple.
raised in 3 days.
Exactly. His resurrection is the ultimate anchor for Christian hope. It calls us to a faith centered not just on temporary displays of power, but on his completed work, his sacrifice, and his victory over death.
That's powerful. Ellen White ties it all together so well, doesn't she? Showing how in both the joy of a wedding and the seriousness of the temple confrontation,
Christ was doing what?
he was unveiling his singular mission to renew human hearts and to restore genuine communion with God.
Yeah, she says he enters human joy to sanctify it,
Yeah.
and he enters holy spaces to purify them. It's about restoration.
Beautifully put. So these events, they didn't just establish his historical presence in Galilee and Jerusalem.
No, they profoundly unveiled his identity as the source of overflowing grace, the true bridegroom bringing joy.
And also as the righteous purifier, the true temple where God meets humanity.
It's all there, right in chapter 2.
Amazing. Okay, so here's something to really sit with after exploring this chapter, something to mull over.
Right.
If Jesus' body is the true temple, raised and glorified, how does that fundamentally change where you look for God and how you understand true worship taking place today?
That's a great question to end on.
Think about that.